We're all here. So welcome to Wednesday night at the lab. My name is Liz Jesse, and I'm a science outreach specialist at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. On behalf of the Biotechnology Center, UW Extension and Cooperative Extension, Wisconsin Public Television, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, I would like to thank you for coming out tonight to Wednesday night at the lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it is my extreme pleasure to introduce June Dahl. She is a professor emerita of neuroscience at UW-Madison School of Medicine and Public Health. Dr. Dahl completed her BA in chemistry from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, and she earned her doctorate in physical chemistry from Iowa State University. She arrived in Madison with her husband when he joined the UW-Madison chemistry department. In 1984, she was appointed to the Controlled Substances Board, Wisconsin's drug regulatory authority. It was service on that board, along with a bill introduced into Congress in 1986 to make heroin available for pain treatment for the dying, that led to her focus on educational and policy issues directed at improving the management of pain. Tonight, Dr. Dahl will provide a review of opioids and their use, and she will address the importance of maintaining a balance so that efforts to reduce abuse of these drugs do not interfere with the appropriate medical use. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming June Dahl.
Hello. I guess I don't...
Microphone.
The microphone needs to be turned on.
Turned on.
What an amazing thing. Is that okay now?
No. Is it now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, that was not a very good beginning. Shall we start all over again? So I selected this as the title of the comments I'm going to make to you tonight. The opioid crisis in historic perspective. And what I would like to do is define some terms, starting with the word opioid, since we're going to talk about the opioid crisis. What are these drugs? And I suspect all of you know what they are. They relieve pain, they cause sedation, they suppress cough, they cause constipation, and they include the illegal drug, heroin, and also a lot of pain medicines that are available by prescription. None of them is available over the counter at this point in time, and they're drugs like oxycodone and hydrocodone and codeine and morphine, and there are a whole bunch others. One of the points I would like to make is that some of these drugs contain other things besides opioids, and one of them that's very commonly prescribed is Vicodin, which is hydrocodone and acetaminophen. And the acetaminophen is a rather dangerous drug. If you take a lot of it, you can have severe damage to the liver. Now, that was a description of some of the opioids. I've just put this slide in very quickly to tell you that there are a lot of others. And you can distinguish them one from the other by how long they last or by how they are given. So there's short-acting drugs and long-acting drugs, and then there are ultra-short-acting drugs. And the only one that's really used a lot today in the ultra-short-acting category is fentanyl, which can be given intravenously or transmucosally. Now, when we talk about these drugs, perhaps you can tell me, how long do short-acting opioids produce pain relief? Do you know how?
2 hours.
2 hours. Somebody else got another number? 4. Well, you could both be right. Because how do we know how long a drug gives pain relief? You ask the patient. I always tell the students that every patient is an individual pharmacologic experiment. So you can't just read a textbook or a manuscript and figure out how long it lasts. You have to ask the person. So some people get 6 hours of pain relief from morphine, but most get 3 to 4, and some may even get 2. In the long-acting category, there's a whole range of durations, from 8 hours to perhaps even as much as 24. And something like fentanyl doesn't last long at all. You have to keep giving it in order to get an effect. There also are antagonists. And has anybody here not heard of naloxone or Narcan? Everyone has, because it's used a lot to reverse the respiratory depressant effects of morphine and other opioids. And another drug in this family is naltrexone. And you can see that there are a whole bunch of brand names there. Again, that's used for different purposes. And then there are the new kids on the block. And these are the abuse deterrent opioid formulations. And they've been put together to try to keep people from abusing this class of medicines. How well do you think they work? Well, I would say that anybody who is determined to abuse a drug can figure out a way to circumvent the formulations. And so they aren't abuse-proof, but that's not a surprise to you. So that was the overview of opioids, but what about the word crisis? I looked that up in the dictionary. You all probably know because you're more learned than I. What's a crisis? Any event that's going to lead or is expected to lead to an unstable and dangerous situation. And it can affect an individual, or it can affect a group or a community or whole society. And crises have damaging effects at various levels. Is there a crisis involving opioids? And what's the evidence for that crisis? Well, actually, there's more than one crisis relating to opioid analgesics. One of them relates to overdosage and deaths. And I've put some figures up here, but you can't really be certain about the numbers. How many people die of overdose in a year? It's not certain, and we get various numbers, but I want to compare the number of deaths with the number of deaths of soldiers who died during the Vietnam War, and also the number of persons who died of car crashes back in 1972 when car crashes peaked in this country. And then how many people died in 1995 because of HIV/AIDS infection. So you can see that the numbers for opioids are very large indeed. So, in fact, there's another crisis with opioids that I want to talk about, and that is the fact that concerns about their diversion and abuse is leading to their underutilization, and that's leading to people experiencing unrelieved pain. So what's pain? It all starts with pain, actually, and we get different feelings about what pain is depending upon the era in which we get information. If we look at the giants of ancient Greece, Plato and his student Aristotle, they considered pain to be an emotional, not a sensory experience. And pain was an independent being that invaded our bodies, took it over. If you've had severe pain, doesn't that sometimes feel that way to you? Aristotle said that pain's like a spirit that enters through an injury. This traditional view of pain as an external force has been a persistent one. Pain is often seen as an act of God or of gods, as a kind of punishment or a test of faith. And the word pain actually comes from the Latin that means penalty. During the Renaissance, Descartes took a different view. And in the 1600s, he refuted the idea that pain came from the outside. He proposed that pain was due to an internal mechanical process, that the body was a machine, and pain was a disturbance within the machine. And then we go to evolutionary theory, where pain is a way that the body defends itself, and it reminds us to avoid the causes of pain in the future. The intensity should be proportional to the risk that the stimulus creates for us. However, natural selection is rarely perfect, so some things are disproportionately more painful than the risk they pose. And I ask you to think about the lowly paper cut. I find those extraordinarily painful. And think, on the other hand, about the real agony of gout. I found, you probably can't see this too well, but I found this online, of course, where everything is. And I can see this incredible red swelling. This is enormously painful. And I like this cartoon much better. You see this ugly little being. I like his tail. And I don't know why I think it's a male rather than a female. But this is the gout. And you can see how he's going after the joint. And then we should consider the pain of what some have called wounded warriors. These are persons who are injured in conflicts. Seriously wounded soldiers were questioned after receiving their wounds by Lieutenant Colonel Henry Beecher. And these individuals had been injured during the invasion of Anzio in Italy. If you ask young kids about the Anzio beachhead invasion, they have no idea what you're talking about, but I suspect you folks do. What he found was that if he surveyed these soldiers 12 hours after their injuries, that 25% of them said they had slight pain, 32% had no pain, and 3/4 of them felt so little pain that they didn't think they needed medication. The soldiers' wounds released them from this horrendous situation, which might ultimately threaten their whole being. This wasn't the case with veterans of the Iraq War. And it's not the case with persons who are injured in accidents, industrial accidents that produce similar kinds of lesions. Those persons are very vigorous in their demand, I should say. I wrote pursuit here, but it's really demand for pain relief. And the International Association for the Study of Pain put these concepts together very nicely when they created a definition of pain in 1975. They recognized the dual nature of pain and said it's an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage or described in terms of such damage. That certainly captures very well the kinds of reports that we see from individuals who were injured in various situations. Now, we need to talk, because I was asked to do so, a little bit about the history of opioid analgesics themselves, the history of embracing and rejecting their use. How many times has this pendulum swung? 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 12? What do you think? Actually, the swing has really been fairly large and numerous. And so we need to look a bit about opium history. The earliest reference to opium growth and use was in about 3400 BC. That was even before I was born. By 1300 BC, the Egyptians were cultivating opium, and they named it on the basis of the capital of Egypt at that time, which was Thebes. Hippocrates, who is considered to be the father of medicine, noted way back when the painkilling properties of opium. And around 330 BC, Alexander the Great introduced opium to Persia and India. And then comes Paracelsus. Any chemists in the audience know about this individual. He's putatively the father of toxicology. And he's the person who actually compounded laudanum. Laudanum is 10% opium and alcohol. And that led me to ask the question is, when did alcohol come into human use? Anybody got a guess? 10,000 years ago. Because, of course, you don't have to take the alcohol from some plant or anything like that. It's produced when plants ferment. So it's pretty accessible if you look out for it. Thomas Sydenham, who's considered the father of English medicine, or the British Hippocrates, recognized the power of opium around 1680. He wrote a couple of things that I think are statements that we ought to think about, that I really adhere to at the present time. He said opium, and I would substitute opioid analgesics, is one of the most valued medicines in the world, which does more honor to medicine than any remedy whatsoever. He also wrote that among the remedies which it has pleased God Almighty to give to man to relieve his sufferings, none is so universal and efficacious as opium. Those words are still true today. And so, in many ways, these are God's gift to humanity. What's this? That's a poppy. Isn't that gorgeous? That's the source of opium. Now, how do we get opium from this poppy? Well, not from grinding up the poppy leaves, not at all, but from waiting for the plant to dry and form these pods. And notice that wonderful drip there? Opium comes from that juice of the poppy pods. And people can score these pods, open them up, and the juice will run out. Now, the poppy juice contains morphine, and it also contains codeine and thebaine. And thebaine is important because it serves as a raw material for the synthesis of other opioids. One of the opioids that's gotten great attention all of the time is heroin. And heroin is actually diacetyl morphine. And why is it so abused? Well, because it's less bulky than morphine and it's easier to smuggle. What's the source of morphine today? Where does it come from? The juice. That's right. There's drugs that cannot be synthesized de novo in the laboratory, and opioids are one category, and cardiac glycosides constitute another category. I'm sure it won't be long before there are synthetic processes to produce morphine in the laboratory, but right now that's not the case. So here are some structures for chemists who love to look at structures. And there's morphine. Notice those two hydroxyl groups, and they get acetylated, and the acetylation transforms that molecule to heroin. Down below morphine is methadone. You ever heard of that? It's a long-acting, orally effective drug. It could also be given parenterally. Methadone was synthesized by German chemists during the Second World War because their supply of natural opioids was cut off, and they needed very effective medicines to treat pain. Notice hydromorphone in the upper right-hand corner, and that's very similar to morphine. It is in many ways, except it's more potent. Does that mean it's more effective? No, it just means you give less of the drug to get the same pharmacologic effect. And notice down in the bottom corner is the drug naloxone. Many of you already knew what that drug was, but I told you before, this is an opioid antagonist. So you can see by simple transformation of the structure of morphine to naloxone, you get a compound that is an antagonist of opioid actions. Doesn't have actions of its own. It's just a blocker.
Can I ask you, why is that?
Why is that?
Yeah.
I have no idea why that is. It has something to do with structure-activity relationships, but I can't answer your question easily. It would take me about 20 minutes, but we can do that later. How's that? Is it a deal? I don't think he really wants to have 20 minutes, but he asked the question. So a little bit about opium history. Before 1800, crude opium was widely available in the United States, and it was an ingredient in multi-drug preparations. And of course, as I've already told you, in laudanum, which was 10% opium in alcohol. And it was very valued for its calming and soporific effects. It was also a specific treatment for GI illnesses. Given that opioids cause constipation, it's an interesting balance to think about treating GI illnesses. It was a drug that was prescribed really supplied very freely by physicians. It calmed teething children, and it also calmed hysterical housewives. Now, I don't know if it calmed hysterical husbands or not, but I will look into that. I've got to find it. In pill form. A drug that calmed people down was very appealing because physicians had almost nothing to work with at that point in time. There weren't effective agents. There wasn't even aspirin. So that was the good times. when there was opium and it was freely available. So we're talking about the history of embracing and rejecting the use. What happened? What happened was that morphine use became a booming business in the 1800s in this country. It had been isolated from opium by a German pharmacist in 1803, and he named it Morphia, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. And manufacture of morphine salts started in 1832, and the hypodermic needle was perfected in the middle of the century. Wasn't this wonderful for those persons who were serving in the Civil War? During the 1800s, there was a dramatic increase in the consumption of morphine, and the per capita peaked in 1896, just at the end of the century. And then the pendulum swung back. Reaction to the freewheeling use of the 1800s. And in 1906, there was the Pure Food and Drug Act. In 1914, the Harrison Act, which regulated and taxed the production, importation, and distribution not only of opiates, but also of cocoa products. And then in 1919, the Supreme Court outlawed addiction maintenance. And then in 1937, there was what was called the Marijuana Tax Act. And marijuana was linked to other alarming drugs, such as cocaine and heroin. So that was the era when marijuana became really bad stuff. And in the 20 years between 1930 and 1950, the severity of the anti-drug laws increased, and it peaked in 1956 when there was a death penalty for the sale of heroin to minors. And I thought about that when I heard that Trump had recommended the death penalty for narcotic dealers in this country. I think that was the word that was used. So now we look at some of the other perspectives, and here's one about the use of medications for controlling pain in persons who are dying of cancer. This was published in 1941 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Dr. Lee wrote, "The use of narcotics in terminal cancer is to be condemned if it can possibly be avoided. Morphine and terminal cancer are in no way synonymous. Morphine usage is an unpleasant experience to the majority of human subjects because of undesirable side effects." Wow. Dominant in these list of unfortunate effects is addiction. What about all those people who abuse these drugs because they really like them? And then the pendulum swings again because an emphasis came on end-of-life care, and that changed the perspective on the use of opioids. In 1948, Dame Cicely Saunders began her work in England, and she applied the name hospice care to specialized care of the dying. That term actually goes back to medieval times. It means a place to shelter weary or ill persons who have traveled long distances. The interesting thing was that Dr. Saunders used heroin to treat her patients who were dying. Remember, heroin is diacetyl morphine. It's a controversial way to give morphine. For some reason, Dame Saunders thought that there was something special about heroin, and it took a lot of convincing to get her to change her mind. In 1967, she founded St. Christopher's Hospice in London, and then in 1974, Florence Wald, who was Dean of the School of Nursing at Yale, established the first hospice in the United States in Branford, Connecticut. But this was a focus really on cancer pain. And in 1984, a bill was introduced into the Congress to make heroin available to treat pain in the terminally ill. Now, this bill did not become law, but this bill stimulated my interest in impediments to effective pain control. That was the summer, 1984, when our family did its Washington trip. And the Washington Post published an editorial strongly supportive of the heroin bill. Well, I tried to get into the paper to talk to the editors, and I didn't succeed in that. I was told I didn't know what I was talking about. And I tried to talk to members of Congress, equally unsuccessfully. But I came back to Madison and I decided we ought to do something about pain in a way that heroin's availability couldn't possibly do. And with that kind of desire, we established some programs here to focus attention on cancer pain. And it worked very well because in 1986, the World Health Organization introduced the analgesic ladder, gave a perspective on how to treat the pain of cancer as it increases in intensity. But that was also a time when there was a lot of illegal drug use. In the 60s, there was an astonishing increase in the use of illegal drugs. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act was passed, and in 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration was established, and Richard Nixon set up its purpose, which was to wage an all-out global war on the drug menace. What did Nixon's efforts really do? Well, what they really did was to reduce the production of opium by Turkish farmers. And in so doing, we've had a shortage of morphine in this country, a shortage of morphine to treat persons in pain. Unfortunately, cancer pain management, which started so beautifully with efforts in England and subsequently in Connecticut, it remains a significant concern in ambulatory oncology, and I've given a reference in this slide to a paper from 2014 that discusses the problem and tells us that the magnitude and scope of pain treatment inadequacy hasn't decreased substantially in the past decades in the United States, despite the fact that there's been a long-standing awareness of this problem. Just gotten worse in many ways. Good for you. In the early 1900s, nearly 900 ECOG, Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group clinicians were surveyed about pain treatment barriers. Half of them thought their patients had good pain control, and a number of the clinicians surveyed cited many concerns about pain assessment, about the adverse effect of opioids, about the reluctance that patients had to report their pain and take their medications. And medical oncologists today, in 2018, still identify those barriers to effective pain control. Also, it was seen long ago, 20 years ago or more, that non-Hispanic white patients and patients with the most obvious burden of illness are most likely to receive adequate cancer pain management. That shouldn't surprise us at all. And then there's some sentinel events we need to be concerned about. In 1986, Russ Portnoy and Kathy Foley of Memorial Sloan Kettering published a seminal paper on the use of opioid analgesics for the treatment of chronic non-cancer pain. Remember, the discussions previously had all been about treating pain in persons who had cancer. And then in the 1990s, extended release opioid formulations were introduced. And the one, of course, we've heard most about is OxyContin, which is extended release or controlled release or sustained release oxycodone. In 1997, the pain standards from the Joint Commission were promulgated, which meant that healthcare facilities could no longer ignore pain. And I was extraordinarily pleased to get a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to work with the Joint Commission to develop these standards. And it's been really frustrating to read that those standards are responsible for our current problems with diversion and abuse of opioids. Apparently, if you don't ask anybody about pain, you won't ever have a problem because you don't have to treat. In the early 2000s, there was a rapid increase in the prescribing of opioid analgesics, and then also an increase in the diversion and abuse of drugs, and increased deaths from these drugs. And sadly, a lack of evidence for the efficacy of opioids for the management of persistent, I'm using that word instead of chronic, persistent non-cancer pain. What's the future? What are the crises in pain management that we need to be concerned about? Well, one of them I've already suggested is the case, and that is the lack of evidence for outcomes. An inadequate education of primary care providers And it's upon this group of providers that the major burden of care has fallen. There's a lack of access to multidisciplinary care. Well, why is that so darn important? Because we have to use a diversity of methods and drugs in order to manage pain effectively. There's an inadequate reimbursement for behavioral and physical therapies. And then, as I've said already, there's an uncertainty about the value of opioid treatment for chronic non-cancer pain. And a big problem with managing chronic pain, persistent pain in persons who have a history of substance use disorders. As you probably know, we no longer talk about drug abuse and drug abusers. We talk about substance use disorder and persons with substance use disorders. The vocabulary has changed in the last 3 years. And again, repetitive uncertainty about the risk and indeed the meaning of addiction. So what are the benefits and what are the risks associated with opioid treatment? If you're interested in reading anything, I'd be happy to email you papers that provide some insights into the answers to these questions. The effectiveness of opioids for chronic pain has not been adequately studied. But a very astute clinician wrote in a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2016 that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So when he wrote about the use of opioids for the treatment of chronic pain, he really was emphasizing the necessity of achieving the right balance. How do you balance effective treatment of pain against any potential for diversion and abuse? And he rightly wrote about the right balance being achieved through education. There's some very interesting quotes that I will share with you as quickly as possible. One of the things was shared by Chris Passero, who is a nurse practitioner and advocate. A medical director of surgery said to a director of nursing at a prestigious hospital in California, "Please inform all bedside nursing personnel to refrain from asking patients if they have pain. The prevailing understanding is that patients are more likely to complain about pain if nurses ask if they have it. If necessary, doctors will determine if the patient has pain." Another person. What? Oh, no, that wasn't the VA. Oh, a similar perspective, a reaction to the Joint Commission standards, which I take personally, from Jane Ballantyne and Mark Sullivan, who are at the University of Washington. "We believe that opioids will still be overprescribed unless changes are made to the blanket requirement to treat on the basis of the report of pain." They actually believe that you shouldn't ask people if they have pain, because if you do, they might give you a report and that you might make a decision about treatment based upon that patient report. Well, that's not the way to do things. So the problem with chronic pain and opioids is that chronic pain is very prevalent, and it's among the most debilitating medical conditions, but also among the most controversial and complex to manage. How many people in this country have persistent pain? He knows. How many? Oh, you don't know? All the people in the room. 100 million. How's that? A trivial problem, right? The limited therapeutic alternatives for this horrendous problem have combined to produce an over-reliance on opioid meds. And this associated with this alarming increase in diversion and overdose and addiction that physicians understandably have questions about whether and when and how to prescribe opioid analgesics for chronic pain. Josh Bloom wrote an article that he published online very recently, and he said in 2016 it's reported that I don't know how many people died of a drug overdose, maybe 43,000, maybe the number is 33,000 that involved opioids. There's 18,000 deaths from natural and synthetic opioids and methadone. But the important comment he made, which I emphasized before and want to again, is that In 2005 at least, half of the people who died from prescription opioid overdoses had also taken a benzodiazepine. 44% of the time they had taken alcohol. These sedative drugs are very lethal when combined with opioid analgesics. The other important point is that now we've seen a change in the source of the drugs that are abused or are involved in opioid overdoses. 90% of opioid overdose deaths in the recent years were a result of illicit fentanyl and its analogs, or heroin, or a combination of opioid drugs with other drugs of abuse. And alcohol is certainly a drug of abuse. The other point he made, which is very important, is that pain patients who use opioids correctly and responsibly are not the persons who are dying of overdose. They're not. Now, how about controlling the swing of the opioid pendulum? Again, another article published recently in the New England Journal of Medicine. Some clinics have established policies of not prescribing opioids at all. And yet we know that opioids are an important part of the therapeutic armamentarium. And as the pendulum swings from liberal opioid prescribing to a more rational, measured, and safer approach, we can strive to ensure that it doesn't swing too far, leaving patients suffering as a result of injudicious policies. What about the effect of opioids and non-opioids on pain-related function in patients with chronic pain problems? There was a paper published relatively recently in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The authors concluded that treatment with opioids was not superior to treatment with non-opioids for improving pain-related function over 12 months. They said that the results do not support the initiation of opioid therapy for moderate to severe chronic back pain or hip pain or knee pain if it's due to osteoarthritis. But they don't support discontinuation of therapy. So this JAMA paper has attracted an awful lot of attention. And the results have been used to justify aggressive tapering or immediate discontinuation. What happens if you've got somebody who's been on an opioid for a long time and you stop their drug?
We're going through withdrawals.
Yeah, you go through terrible withdrawal. And Medicare misread the recommendations. The CDC gave a 90 milligram red flag for patients in acute pain who are just starting opioid therapy. It's not for patients with chronic pain who have been taking opioids for a long period of time. And yet the results were used to justify aggressive tapering or immediate discontinuation. To repeat what's on line 1, actions that could harm people. And so the authors of that publication, which recommended that you not start opioids with persons who have certain osteoarthritic pains, said we can't walk away from patients who've been treated for years, even for decades. We've created double tragedy for those patients. So how many times has the opium pendulum swung? Well, here's another report. It was an internet post. I tried to get the source. This describes John, a former cable company salesman who's used OxyContin, that horrible drug, to treat the severe back pain caused by injuries he sustained during a mugging in 2011. Before he found a medication that worked for him, he said, "My wife was about to leave me because I was a miserable bastard." When you're in that much pain, you just want to go to sleep and not wake up. Last fall, John was told that by a physician assistant that his dose was going to be reduced. It had been 60 milligrams 3 times a day. The PA said this was too high and would have to be dramatically reduced under a new rule. I guess that rule is the CDC guideline that didn't set any mandatory limit, but it recommended people not start on high doses of 90 milligrams per day. He said, "My whole life turned upside down in a matter of 30 days. I'm back in bed now. I can't really get up very much. I'm right back where I started in 2011. So we have another opioid crisis as well. We have the crisis where people are not getting adequate treatment, but there's a shortage of opioids as a result of this callback of opioid availability. And it's left many hospitals and surgical centers scrambling to find enough injectable morphine or Dilaudid or fentanyl. These are drugs given to patients who aren't abusers but are undergoing surgery, or they've had cancer, or they have traumatic injuries. This shortage, which were reported last summer, has worsened now. And then another opioid crisis. It isn't just opioids. Overdose deaths linked to legal and illegal drugs. Remember, benzodiazepines and alcohol. The author of this comment said that he believes there's an increase in deaths of despair, that something deeper has gone wrong in American life because of poor mental health care, jobs leaving parts of the country, and a growing sense of social isolation. When the public was recently polled to ask their perspective about the opioid abuse epidemic, the results were very interesting to me. A majority didn't deem addiction to pain medicine was a national emergency, and few people see it as an emergency or a major problem in their own community. So public and private sector leaders are looking for a substantial increase in funding for opioid addiction treatment programs, yet a large share of the public is really uncertain about the long-term effectiveness of treatment. So we have this lack of understanding of the problems that exist. Many medical experts say that the CDC guidelines play up the hazards of opioids while playing down their benefits. The overall message is that clinicians should be stingy with these medicines, prescribing them only as a last resort and maintaining the lowest possible doses. Despite the CDC's protesting to the contrary, the mission of preventing abuse and diversion seems to be interfering with the average pain practitioner's duty to provide appropriate care. And it leads, in extreme cases, to suicides by patients who can't seem to get the relief that they need. So, concluding, our challenge, we need to maintain our focus on pain. Its undertreatment is a major public health problem in the United States. Certainly, the number of persons who have chronic or persistent pain is just mind-boggling to me. We need to maintain a balance. We need to assure that efforts to reduce the diversion and abuse of opioids don't interfere with their appropriate medical use. I think that is not the case at the present time. I think there's a lot of interference with appropriate medical use. And don't forget our other prescription drug problem, which I have alluded to more than once, the benzodiazepines. Deaths involving benzodiazepines increased from 1135 in 1999 to 8971 in 2015, and I couldn't find the 2017 data to present to you, but I doubt the number has gone down, despite efforts to reduce the prescribing and thus the availability of benzodiazepines. 3/4 of deaths involving benzodiazepines, at least a couple of years ago, also involved an opioid, a lethal combination. I think it's important also to accept the challenge presented by the National Academy of Medicine. We need a cultural transformation to better prevent, assess, treat, and understand pain of all types. The level of ignorance is really profound. It always astonishes me. And the number of hours spent on pain in medical school curricula is trivial compared to the magnitude of the problem. I think it also is important to embrace the philosophy of the Dalai Lama. Pain is inevitable. We're all going to get it, unless we have this genetic predisposition where we can't feel any pain. We have this abnormal sodium 1.7 channel, that voltage-gated channel, and it's odd because we don't feel pain. But for all the rest of folks, except those 200 or so persons with that genetic abnormality, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. And what we've got to do is to make suffering much less in this country. It's not optional for us to allow things to continue as they are, and they're only getting worse at the present time. So I thank you for your very kind attention. I'm sorry some of you could not sit down. I wanted to tell you to come sit in here. There's seats in a row. And I thank you for your attention. I guess if you have questions or comments, there's time for them. Yes, sir.
I was just going to ask, so have we figured out, like, our threshold for pain, and have we figured out how to really measure it? Or do you think we do more research?
A threshold for pain.
Right.
Would you like to be a little more specific or detailed with me? Because I don't quite understand.
Like, I would have to figure that depending on the person, their threshold for pain is probably higher or lower. Like, you know, like for me, I have cerebral palsy and I basically have pain all the time, and I basically have a higher threshold than other people that don't have pain.
I think everybody has a certain threshold. But I guess we need to talk about your question apart from the group, because that's a very complicated question, very difficult for me to answer succinctly.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned about addiction. I was glad to hear that people don't really, that the majority of Americans don't seem to think that addiction is a big, serious problem. I don't know what addiction is, and I don't know why it's considered damaging to be addicted. I mean, so what's the damage behind being addicted to a drug, and what are the side effects?
Depends on the drug. And addiction is a word that I think we're trying to throw out of the vocabulary because it doesn't have a clear meaning. It usually means use despite harm and alterations in physical and psychological functioning. So people do a variety of things that are inappropriate when they become addicted to a drug. So the tendency is to get rid of that word and really, as I mentioned very briefly, to talk about substance use disorders, but that doesn't get at the problem either. But what is addiction? Who in the audience would like to tell me what you think addiction means? What does it mean to you?
I can give it a shot because I've been through it before. I got hooked on that. Addiction's where you crave that substance. You do just about anything to get it.
That's a very good description of what happens to a person who becomes addicted. Excessive compulsive behavior, use despite harm. And he's articulated that very well.
I mean, the use of the word addiction has come into vocabulary a lot. Maybe it's an excuse for, you can't pass up a donut. And they're addicted to donuts or sugar, and somehow I think that that's a misuse of the word addiction, and I don't know whether really addiction really means because it's overuse.
Well, I agree. It would be good to get it out of the vocabulary. But it generally refers to use despite harm and continued use. You can't stop using the substance. But the effort is being made to eliminate it from the vocabulary. So we talk about substance use disorders, but get into complexities with those terms as well. So we used to confuse the word addiction and thought that if a person was tolerant to a drug or developed physical dependence, so they would go through withdrawal if they abruptly discontinued its use, that voila, they were addicted. So effort is being made to discriminate among those terms so that we don't talk about people who have a pain issue and are using an opioid and do become physically dependent and may become tolerant. They aren't addicted. They're very different kinds of phenomena. Does that make any sense to you? because we all, almost all of us, if we use these drugs persistently, will become physically dependent. And if we suddenly stop them, we'll go through withdrawal. And withdrawal can be extraordinarily miserable depending upon the dose that a person had used and the time frame over which it has been used. But this confusion of the terms has been something that has really set the cause back significantly. Does that make any sense? Yes?
Other than the word, are there other ways to deal with pain that do not involve opioids?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Like what?
Well, how about aspirin?
The same pain that opioids are used for.
Well, what pain do you think opioids should be used for?
You're asking a personal opinion or a...
Well, I think it's very important to get a sense of this because generally they are effective against severe pain. And when do you have severe pain? When you have a surgical procedure, when you fracture a limb, something of that sort. So opioids are generally important to provide relief of severe pain. If you use that 0 to 10 scale, where 0 is no pain, 10 is the worst pain you can imagine, when you get up to 5 or 6, you may need to get an opioid in order to get adequate relief. But there's aspirin, there's acetaminophen, there's a plethora of nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and of course there's yoga, and there's imagery and distraction and a physical therapy, all sorts of non-drug approaches that can be used to provide relief of pain. It all depends on the individual, but those non-drug therapies are the ones that are not being paid for. So it's pretty difficult for people to get those kinds of therapies, and there's not a plethora of people who are providing those treatments either. But there's lots of drugs. And along that line, if you have neuropathic pain, you know what that is. It can be sharp shooting, stabbing, funny kinds of feelings. There's other drugs, such as antidepressants and drugs used to control seizures that are particularly effective for relieving neuropathic pain. Opioids can provide relief, but the nonsteroidals and acetaminophen are not effective for that particular kind of pain. So the most important thing that has to be done initially is to do an assessment. Not only the intensity of the pain, but also the type of pain, so that you can get some idea of what the cause is, and that can be used to generate the appropriate response. Does that make any sense?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
So, isn't one of the drivers of which way the pendulum happens to be swinging, and I guess it's not necessarily swinging only one way at any given time, but isn't one of the pushes the social stigma of addiction, seeing people who are fortunate enough to be addicted as victims or criminals, depending on which side of the knife you are, I guess, you know. So there's that whole component also that, you know, how does our society view the crisis? Is it good for business? Is it bad for business? Is it good that certain sectors of our population are ill? Do we care or don't we care? You know? So there's more to it than just the chemical realities that push the day out so well.
Oh,
You know.
absolutely. There's a lot of sociology involved, and I don't know much about sociological confirmations and things of that sort, but obviously we put a lot of people in prison for things that don't make any sense to me, that in things that involve drug utilization. And I'd much rather see them have some kind of therapy. And I'm pleased to see that there is a push to, in fact, provide some kind of non-drug therapies for people and non-prison therapies for people who have problems with drugs right now. I don't know if that'll continue, but I'm hoping that the future will bring that. Yes, sir.
I'm just reflecting on your work with pain as a vital sign and also the WHO's analgesic ladder. I wonder if you could reflect on the importance of education in policy, because that's both JCAHO and the WHO that you were playing with, and those have been informative tools, but they've also been turned back on some of the message that you've been conveying tonight.
Absolutely. Let me talk about the Joint Commission standards. First, it's very important to point out that we did not in any way ever state that pain was a fifth vital sign. That has been something that's been stated by other persons, particularly some of the persons who are very opposed to opioid use. So the Joint Commission standards have been kind of distorted by certain policymakers in this country. So they were never intended, there wasn't a word in the standards as they were initially constructed in 1979, nothing about how to treat pain. The word opioid was not mentioned. In fact, the word opioid doesn't appear in the standards until the January 2018 edition of the standards. Never was the word in there at all. You also asked about, I'm sorry, my brain is...
That's okay, the pain, the analgesic bladder with the WHO.
Well, that's been a controversial thing as well. And certainly I don't think we can use that as an absolute guideline for treatment, because that does not take into account the type of pain that a person is experiencing. That just looks at nociceptive pain, the garden variety kind of pain that you have with cancer, or that you have, for example, when you fracture a limb, something of that sort. So that kind of misses out on the whole context of how you have to use drugs from different classes in order to get at pain of a particular kind. I don't know if that's what you were thinking of or not, but it's an important construct in that regard. Yes, sir.
If we look at the opioid use in the United States, there's an enormous overuse in terms of number of pills prescribed, which you haven't talked about. And it's hard to show that the well-being of the American patient is improved by that overuse. Pain is a subjective complaint. Opioids work by a receptor in the brain, basically altering the receptor in a manner that not only pain is relieved, but also there may be euphoria. There are people that perhaps realize that the way they can get that euphoria is by complaining of pain, which is a hard thing to disprove. The dilemma of the medical profession is to make wise decisions about when to use opioids, but just because somebody's reporting pain doesn't mean that there should be a reflex response to prescribed opioids. Now, an example would be treatment of headache, where the American Academy of Neurology is on record as saying that they do more harm than good, and many neurologists, myself included, would agree with that.
And I absolutely agree with that.
And so it's a complicated situation, and on the one hand you have cancer patients and people with terminal cardiovascular disease, no argument at all. But there's a big gray area where opioids are being greatly overprescribed and causing tremendous problems in our country.
Well, I think your point about headache is just a critical one, because there certainly is little, if any, evidence that opioids have efficacy against migraine headaches. They're the last thing that you ought to use, and I think you would agree with me on that, right?
Yes.
And so I think it depends on the type of pain. And often, for example, for a neuropathic pain problem, it may take a really hefty dose of an opioid to get control of the pain. It'd be far more rational to use an antidepressant or some drug of a different pharmacologic family in order to get control of that pain. So your point is very well taken by me as an important way to look at this. Every patient is an individual pharmacologic experiment, and it isn't just the intensity of pain that you've got to look at, it's the type of pain that people are presenting. So opioids are not the panacea. They're not the drugs for everybody. And a lot of the overutilization today is not by people who are wanting the drugs to treat pain, but I think are being desired by people who want to use drugs to alter their mood. That's a very different scenario. So I don't think that answers your question or comments very well, but I believe that you and I are in agreement about things in that regard. So it's a complicated thing because there are lots of folks who really do need to be treated with opioids. And what bothers me right now is that there are surgical patients who are not getting adequate doses of opioids. And I worry about the impact that that unrelieved acute pain will have, because we know that unrelieved acute pain is a risk factor for the development of chronic pain problems. So it's a tremendous balancing act. And I'm glad you made those comments. It's not a simple matter at all. And we did go probably overboard in terms of recommending the use of these drugs. And I don't know if we can be responsible for all the promotion of the drugs that was done by the pharmaceutical industry. That's a subject that we could talk about for 2 or 3 hours, I think. Yes?
Is there any requirement in the analysis of overdose deaths that a screen for benzodiazepines, alcohol, and other potentiating substances are included in the testing of the people who have died of an overdose?
I would assume I'd have to speak to someone who's in this business of doing these analyses, that there's an exhaustive analysis in which all types of drugs are looked for. If I can't find a nice term to say it, looked for is not very scientifically elegant, but I'm sure that there's a broad screening for all kinds of drugs when people experience overdoses. It's not just restricted to opioids by any means. And I would think benzodiazepines would be very important. One of the problems is that alcohol gets out of the body very quickly. So if someone has died and alcohol's a problem, it may be gone before the analyses are done. Hard to say. But there are all sorts of other drugs too, because the drugs that are used to treat neuropathic pain are not without hazardous nature. They can certainly cause death in overdose. Antidepressants, antipsychotics can do that too. Yes?
So I'm interested in the benzodiazepines. Has there been also an increase in the prescriptions of these drugs as we've seen the overdose deaths?
No, in fact, there's been a decline in the prescribing of those drugs. I think the efforts to make people aware of the risks associated with combining those drugs with other agents is really reaching people. But that doesn't mean that they can't get the drugs from illicit sources.
Is there a reason that these drugs are used together in such frequency that it would cause overdoses?
I think, I don't, anybody here know the answer to that? I would expect it, people like the feeling that if they use an opioid and they add a benzodiazepine, that whatever it is that they find desirable in these drugs is enhanced. That's a great question. I don't know the answer.
I can tell you a little bit about it. Children nowadays don't realize what benzodiazepines do for you. They think they're going to get the big buzz that they get from narcotics. They don't get it from the benzodiazepine. So what do? They drink alcohol with it, thinking that they're going to get a better buzz. And that's where you get the overdose from those.
Interesting. Yes?
Any idea how many overdose deaths are due to overprescribed pills as opposed to illicit drugs?
The illicit heroin and fentanyl derivatives like carfentanil. I think that we're seeing, I don't know the numbers, but if you send me an email, I will get you those numbers.
They're so readily available even over the internet.
Oh my, that's a terrible thing. There are many things about the internet that I don't like. And one of them is the availability of all sorts of garbage that people can take to their detriment. And I'm very disturbed when you talk about young people using these agents. That's tragic, isn't it? Yes, sir.
Would you say more about the second bullet? I mean, it sounds good, but that's what the pharmaceutical industry says, and that's what Sackler and other people have done. They wanted a cultural change. They made opioids more available, more affordable, and they got physicians to prescribe them. So what would you say more about that quotation?
You mean maintain a balance? Is that the one you're looking at?
A cultural transformation is necessary to better prevent, assess, treat, and understand.
Oh, the second bullet point here.
Second bullet, yeah.
Well, I think that the pharmaceutical industry has been forced into having a very different stance about these drugs.
Different.
Very different. They're not promoting them anymore.
Okay.
So there's, maybe they don't have to anymore because there's so many available from other sources. I don't know what percentage of drugs come from illicit, out-of-the-country sources at the present time. Certainly for a while, that wasn't a major source of drugs. Yes, I'm sorry.
I think treating, assessing, preventing, and understanding pain is an entirely different concept than pushing opioid use. I think we absolutely need to do the second bullet, and we haven't done the second bullet, and it would require an enormous investment of time and energy, which most of us know, certainly the time is not there when you go to visit your medical care provider, at least in primary care settings. And so, as we do with so many things, we turn to easy answers. And until we're willing to step away from, one size fits all and easy answers, I don't think we're going to be addressing that second bullet, which is a terrible thing.
Well, I think a lot of physicians have become so frustrated by the problem that they simply aren't prescribing anymore. And that's not the answer to the problem either. No. But certainly it is something that many people have considered and decided it's not worth my time and energy. I'm just not going to deal with these drugs. So you see a sign that we don't prescribe opioids here. And often the sign is we don't prescribe narcotics here.
I wouldn't go to such a clinic.
Well, but I think that you've touched on a challenge for people who are in the business of taking care of folks who are ill. And that is that these drugs have become such an overwhelming problem for them that the way that they deal with it is by totally backing away.
Right.
Very important point. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
One here.
Where? I'm sorry.
I wonder if we make a more world view of the problem, especially because the United States and New Zealand are the only two countries in the world where we can advertise pharmaceuticals. Do other countries have the same problem?
Other countries have significant problems with diversion and abuse of these drugs. It's not been of the magnitude that exists in the United States. And please send me an email because I'd like to comment more about that rather than off the top of my head, to think more seriously about it and give you an answer that has some sense to it. Okay? I appreciate that very much. Yes?
I was wondering if you could just talk briefly about how the fentanyl problem got started. You said 90% of heroin overdoses were involving, fentanyl in some way, and I was just wondering, I know that's kind of a more recent thing, and why that started, where it came from.
Well, right now, people who are in the business of marketing drugs for illicit purposes saw the problem here in the United States and decided to take advantage of it. And it's easy to synthesize drugs like fentanyl. So if you're in the business of doing this, you can create this drug pretty cheaply and make a mint of money by bringing it into the United States and marketing it here. Where there's a will, there's a way. In terms of heroin's availability, I can't answer that question satisfactorily. I'm sorry, I'd have to think hard about that. But certainly fentanyl, remember, is a synthetic drug. And those people who run clandestine laboratories, particularly in Mexico and other countries, found a ready market here in the United States for such a drug. So they got to work and are making a mint of money marketing agents like this. I don't think that gets at your question. Does it?
No, that was helpful.
Yes, sir.
I'll take a stab at answering it. So fentanyl's orders of magnitude more potent than just street heroin. So when we have addiction and we move to heroin in the street, we can't get it from doctor shopping. And then fentanyl's so much more potent mixed with these other substances, and that's leading to overdoses. That's my guess.
Well, certainly he's right. Fentanyl's 100 times more potent. That means you give 100 times smaller dose to get the same effect. So you get a real bang for your buck, so to speak, with those drugs. And carfentanil is even worse. So there are derivatives of that agent that are extraordinarily dangerous. I'm surprised there aren't more deaths, in fact. But remember, I've lived in a whole different world, and I'm not in the market for making money. It's never been. But, you know, it would be really a great way to do things, is to get into the drug business, because there's a tremendous market out there. That's for sure.